Gregory Roberts sat in the deep, contoured leather of his customized Cadillac CT6, his gaze fixed on the gray rain-shrouded silhouette of the Willis Tower as it pierced the heavy Chicago clouds. At 48 years old, Gregory was a man who possessed everything the world told him he should want. A real estate empire that spanned 3 continents, a net worth that made bankers stammer, and a name that carried the weight of a 1,000-year dynasty. Yet, as the car glided soundlessly over the cracked asphalt of Lakeshore Drive, he felt like little more than a ghost haunting a very expensive machine. Beside him, folded with clinical precision, sat his titanium wheelchair, a marvel of modern engineering that felt to him like a mobile prison. It had been 7 years since the accident on the Chicago Skyway, a night of black ice and blinding snow that had turned his sleek vehicle into a mangled cage of steel. He remembered the smell of ozone and gasoline, the terrifying silence of the frozen lake below, and the moment he realized his legs no longer belonged to him. The doctors had called it a miracle that he survived, but as Gregory watched the city move around him, running for buses, couples walking hand-in-hand, cyclists weaving through traffic, he often wondered if miracle was the right word for a life spent watching from the sidelines. His company, Sterling Global, flourished under his iron-willed direction from behind a mahogany desk, but the human element of his life had withered into a series of formal transactions and respectful distances. The gala tonight was the centerpiece of the city's social calendar. The annual Sterling Foundation benefit held at the Peninsula Hotel's Grand Ballroom. It was a world of gold leaf, silk tapestries, and the faint, cold scent of expensive lilies. As Gary, his driver of nearly a decade, expertly deployed the ramp and assisted Gregory into his chair, Gregory felt the familiar, crushing weight of public scrutiny. It was that subtle, awkward moment when a room full of the city's elite would see him coming, and a physical wave of discomfort would ripple through the crowd. People would suddenly find their champagne flutes fascinating or turn to a neighbor with renewed conversational vigor. Anything to avoid making eye contact with the man in the chair. To the board members and the socialites, Gregory Roberts was a tragic figure to be admired from a distance, a reminder of the fragility of their own status. He navigated the room with powerful, rhythmic pushes, his arms built to a startling strength through years of grueling therapy, yet he felt entirely invisible. He was a statue in the middle of a dance, a stationary point around which the vibrant, moving world of the Abelbadit swirled in a blur of tuxedos and gowns. In a quiet corner of the ballroom, framed by a massive arched window overlooking the rainy streets, stood Kimberly White. At 31, Kimberly was out of her element in the world of high-stakes philanthropy. She was a captain with the Chicago Fire Department, a woman whose skin bore the faint, silvery scars of 100 blazes and whose lungs had tasted the soot of every neighborhood from Englewood to Rogers Park. 2 months earlier, she'd made national headlines for pulling a family of 4 from a crumbling apartment fire, staying inside until the roof groaned its final warning. She was here tonight as a reluctant hero of the city, wearing her formal dress uniform with a mix of pride and profound unease. Beside her stood her daughter, Michelle, a 6-year-old, with a mop of unruly curls and a spirit that refused to be dampened by the stifling formality of the hotel. Michelle didn't care about the silent rules of the peninsula. She didn't understand that you weren't supposed to stare at the man in the chair. While the wealthy donors whispered about Gregory's unfortunate state, Michelle saw a man who looked like he had the coolest chair in the world. Kimberly watched her daughter, then looked at Gregory, and she saw past the billionaire's facade. She saw the deep, resonant loneliness in his eyes, a look she had seen on the faces of people she had pulled from the brink of death, the look of someone who had survived the fire but was still waiting to be found. Without a word of warning, Michelle broke away from Kimberly's side and walked straight toward Gregory, stopping just inches from his foot. Gregory, startled out of a dark reverie, looked down into the bright, curious eyes of the little girl. Michelle reached out, her small hand brushing the cold, brushed metal frame of the chair, and asked with the piercing clarity of childhood why he didn't have any lights on his wheels. Because if she had a chair like that, she'd make it glow like a spaceship. Gregory felt a genuine rusty laugh bubble up from his chest, a sound that felt foreign even to his own ears. He told her that he'd have to talk to his engineers about the spaceship idea. And for a moment, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom evaporated. Kimberly stepped forward then, her presence firm and calming, and introduced herself. She didn't offer him the practiced, sycophantic praise he was used to. Instead, she spoke to him with the blunt, honest camaraderie of a fellow survivor. She told him that she'd heard he was the heart of the city's skyline, but she thought the city was lucky to have a heart that knew what it was like to be broken and mended. As the orchestra transitioned into a sweeping melodic walls, the floor began to fill with couples. The distinguished guests were expected to lead the dance, and Gregory prepared himself for the usual exit, the quiet retreat to the shadows where he could watch the world spin without him. But Kimberly White did something that caused a collective intake of breath from the onlookers. She stepped into Gregory's personal space, held out a callously strong hand, and asked the Paralyzed millionaire if he would do her the honor of a dance. Gregory froze, his fingers gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly that the metal felt like it might deform. He felt a wave of hot, searing humiliation wash over him, imagining the spectacle of a man being pushed around the floor, a prop in a performance of charity. He began to stammer an excuse, a polite rejection, but Kimberly didn't move. She looked him in the eye with the steady, unwavering gaze of someone who had faced down walls of flame. She told him that in her job, you learned that movement wasn't about the legs, it was about the direction you chose to face. She said the music was playing for everyone, even those who were stationary, and she'd really hate to waste a good song. Against every instinct of self-preservation, Gregory reached out and placed his hand in hers. The warmth of her grip was startling, a direct connection to a world he thought had forgotten him. As they moved onto the polished wood of the dance floor, Gary stepped back, and Kimberly took the handles of the chair with a gentle, confident strength. She didn't just push him, she moved with him, turning the waltz into a synchronized spinning grace of chrome and silk. As the chair rotated in time with the violins, Gregory felt the wind on his face, the rhythm of the music vibrating through the frame of the chair and into his very bones. For the first time in 7 years, he wasn't a spectator. He was part of the dance. The whispers of the crowd faded into the background, replaced by the sound of Michelle's cheering and the steady, reassuring presence of the woman who wasn't afraid to lead him. He felt a spark of something he thought had died on the Skyway Bridge, a sense of possibility, a realization that his life didn't have to be a museum of what used to be. However, from the velvet-dripped shadows of the VIP mezzanine, a pair of sharp, predatory eyes watched the scene with cold calculation. Diane Collins, Gregory's 65-year-old aunt, and his only surviving relative, watched the firefighter and her nephew with a simmering, quiet rage. To Diane, Gregory was not a person to be loved, but an asset to be managed. Since the accident, she had meticulously cultivated his isolation, whispering in his ear that the world only saw him as a bank account, convincing him that she was the only one he could trust. She had lived in luxury on the periphery of his empire, waiting for the day his spirit would finally break completely so she could take full control of the sterling trusts. Seeing him laugh, seeing him dance with a common firefighter, was a direct threat to the fortress of solitude she had built around him. As the dance ended and Gregory looked up at Kimberly with a glimmer of genuine life in his eyes, Diane set her champagne glass down with a sharp, final click. She knew that the hero of the city had accidentally started a fire in Gregory's heart, and she was already planning the exact way she would quench the flames before they could burn through her carefully constructed lies. In the weeks that followed to benefit the atmosphere within the Sterling Estada, sprawling glass and limestone fortress perched on the edge of Lake Michigan underwent a transformation so subtle yet profound that it felt like the very foundation of the building was shifting. Gregory Roberts found himself waking up before his alarm for the first time in nearly 3,000 days. The persistent, dull ache in his phantom limbs replaced by a quiet, expectant hum of purpose. He had invited Kimberly and Michelle to stay in the West Wing under the guise of Kimberly serving as a specialized safety and emergency consultant for his properties. It was a title Kimberly had initially scoffed at, her firefighter's pride bristling at anything that smelled of a handout. But Gregory had been insistent, pointing out that his aging high-rises needed a veteran's eye to overhaul their fire protocols. In reality, he simply could unbear the thought of the light they brought into his home flickering out and returning to the gray, sterile vacuum he had lived in for 7 years. Kimberly eventually relented, but only after negotiating a contract that ensured she would be working 40 hours a week. Between her firehouse shifts and her new duties for Sterling Global, she was a woman who had never taken a shortcut in her life, and she wasn't about to start now, even if her boss was a man whose daily coffee budget was more than her monthly mortgage. The transition was a collision of two vastly different universes. Michelle, with her boundless energy and pockets full of smooth lake stones, treated the multi-million-dollar estate like a high-tech playground. She would often ride on the back of Gregory's wheelchair, her small arms wrapped around his neck as they zoomed through the long, art-filled corridors, their laughter echoing off the cold marble and breathing life into the silent statues. Gregory, a man who had spent years analyzing market trends and architectural blueprints, found himself relearning the world through the eyes of He taught her the names of the constellations from the terrace using a powerful telescope, and in return, she taught him the names of every dog in the neighborhood and why a specific type of blue crayon was superior to all others. Kimberly, meanwhile, became the anchor of the household. She didn't treat Gregory like a delicate porcelain doll or a legendary titan of industry. She treated him like a man. She would sit with him on the veranda after her long shifts at the station, her face smudged with the lingering fatigue of a captain, and they would talk late into the night. They spoke of the scars they carried as invisible. Hers literally and the way trauma had a habit of narrowing one's vision until you forgot that the horizon still existed. For Gregory, these conversations were more restorative than any physical therapy. Kimberly challenged his cynicism, poked fun at his billionaire exit, and slowly, brick by brick, began to dismantle the fortress of solitude he had spent 7 years constructing. However, as the bond between the millionaire and the firefighter deepened, so did the shadow of Diane Collins. From her vantage point in the North Wing, Diane watched the blossoming friendship with the cold, calculating eye of a general watching an enemy army breach the walls. She saw the way Gregory looked at Kimberly when she walked into a room, the softening of his jaw, the genuine spark in his eye sand. She felt her control over the sterling fortune slipping away like sand through her fingers. Diane had spent nearly a decade ensuring she was the only person Gregory felt he could trust, a gatekeeper who controlled his access to the outside world and, more importantly, to his own confidence. She knew that if Gregory began to see himself as a man worthy of love and a future, he would no longer need her protection, and the millions she had been managing for her own private gain would come under a scrutiny she could not survive. She realized that a simple verbal discouragement wouldn't be enough to remove Kimberly White. She needed a weapon that would strike at the very heart of Gregory, escort his insecurities of fear that he was nothing more than a target for the greedy. To forge this weapon, Diane reached out to Justin Baker, a high-priced private investigator who specialized in reputation management and the fabrication of digital trails. Thorne was a man of shadows, someone who understood that, in the modern world, a well-placed lie with a hint of truth was more effective than a bullet. Diane tasked him with finding or creating a narrative that would paint Kimberly as a professional opportunist. Thorne spent 10 days digging through Kimberly's history, finding a complex legal battle she had fought 3 years prior. After her husband, a fellow firefighter named Michael, had died in the line of duty, Kimberly had been forced into a grueling 2-year litigation against an insurance conglomerate that had tried to deny Michael S.'s death benefits on a technicality. It had been a desperate, exhausting fight for her daughter's future, one that Kimberly had eventually won, but Thorne saw exactly how to twist it. He compiled a dossier that framed Kimberly not as a grieving widow fighting for justice, but as a settlement hunter who had used her husband, Estef, to secure a windfall and was now looking for a bigger, easier target in the form of a paralyzed billionaire. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon, a day when the Chicago wind was howling off the lake, rattling the glass panes of the penthouse. Kimberly was at the station, and Michelle was at a music lesson, leaving Gregory alone in his study. Diane entered, her face a carefully constructed mask of maternal heartbreak. She moved with a slow, heavy gait, clutching the dossier as if it were a physical burden. She sat across from Gregory, her eyes moistening with practiced tears, and told him that she had done something unforgivable. She had doubted his judgment and investigated his new friend. She claimed she had only done it because she loved him, because she couldn't bear to see him broken again. She showed him the records of the lawsuits, the edited transcripts of Kimberly's depositions that made her sound cold and calculating, and the series of financial reports manufactured by Thorne that suggested Kimberly was in deep, hidden debt. Diane whispered that Kimberly's appearance at the gala hadn't been an accident of fate, but a calculated move by a woman who knew exactly which billionaire was the most vulnerable. She told him that the hero was just a high-stakes gambler who had finally hit the jackpot. The impact on Gregory was devastating. Every doubt he had ever harbored about his own worth, every fear that people only stayed because of the zeros in his bank account, came roaring back like a tidal wave. The trauma of his accident had left him with a psyche that was prone to believing the worst about the world, a defense mechanism designed to prevent him from ever being hurt again. As he looked at the documents, the warmth he had felt over the last few weeks began to solidify into a hard, bitter ice. The betrayal felt more painful than the crash on the Skyway, because this time he had let someone inside the wreckage. When Kimberly returned home that evening, expecting to share a quiet dinner and talk about their day, she was met with a version of Gregory Roberts she had never seen, a man whose voice was a serrated blade and whose eyes were two cold, dead stones. In the grand, echoing foyer of the estate, Gregory confronted her. He didn't ask questions. He threw the dossier at her feet, the papers scattering across the marble like the debris of their brief, beautiful connection. He called her a parasite, a professional mourner who had traded her integrity for a chance at his estate. He accused her of using her daughter as a prop in a long con performance of innocence. Kimberly stood frozen, the soot from a fire she had just fought still on her uniform, her heart shattering in real time. She tried to explain the reality of the lawsuit, the years of fighting a faceless corporation to keep a roof over Michelle's head, but the more she pleaded, the more Gregory saw it as the rehearsed defense Diane had warned him about. He told her to take her things and her daughter and to be out of his house within the hour. He said he would have Gary drive them to a motel and that he never wanted to see her face again. Kimberly looked at the man she had begun to love, the man she had seen dance with her daughter, and she realized that the man in the chair was uniparalyzed by his spine, he was paralyzed by his own wealth and the toxic lies of the woman standing triumphant on the stairs behind him. With a dignity that cut through Gregory's rage like a searchlight, Kimberly gathered her daughter and their few belongings. She didn't cry in front of him. She didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing the wound he had inflicted. As they walked out the massive front doors into the biting Chicago night, Michelle looked back at Gregory, her eyes full of a confusion that would haunt his dreams for years to come. She asked why they were leaving, why the fast man looked so angry, and Kimberly simply told her that some people were more afraid of the light than they were of the dark. The doors closed with a heavy, final thud, and the Sterling estate returned to its natural state of silent, opulent misery. Gregory retreated to his study, but the silence he had once craved now felt like a suffocating shroud. He was alone again, the safe billionaire in his chrome cage, unaware that the real predator was currently in the next room, toast to a future she had just successfully stolen. For 3 weeks, the Sterling estate was reclaimed by a silence so absolute it felt structural, as if the very atoms of the building had frozen in the absence of Kimberly's warmth and Michelle's vibrant chaos. Gregory Roberts moved through his days like a man underwater, his company's profits surging while his internal world collapsed into a void of self-loathing and suspicion. He sat in his darkened study, staring at the empty chair where Michelle used to sit and draw, and he realized that the security Diane had promised him was nothing more than a refined version of a grave. Diane was more present than ever, humming through the hallways and presenting him with new investment strategies, her presence a constant, suffocating reminder of the loyalty he had chosen over love. But the truth has a way of rising to the surface, especially when it is buried by a man as pragmatic as Justin Baker. The private investigator, despite his profession, was a man of cold logic who recognized that Diane Collins was a liability. He had discovered a digital trail that Diane hadn't authorized him to find, a series of encrypted communications and offshore transfers that dated back nearly a decade, long before Gregory's world shattered on the Skyway Bridge. One stormy evening, Thorne appeared at the estate without an appointment, bypassing Diane, and entering Gregory's study with the weary air of a man finishing a long, distasteful job. He didn't bring another dossier of lies. He brought a digital recording and a verified ledger from a mechanic in... He sat across from Gregory and played a recording from a hidden mic he had placed in Diane's office during their initial meeting. In the recording, Diane's voice was stripped of its maternal sweetness, replaced by a sharp, predatory greed as she laughed with her lawyer about how easy it was to keep the cripple in his place. But the true horror came next. She spoke of the final adjustment made to Gregory's Cadillac 7 years ago, a subtle, professional tampering with the brake fluid lines designed to fail under the high-pressure conditions of a frozen bridge. Gregory's breath hitched in his chest as the reality settled into his bones. The accident hadn't been an act of God or a stroke of bad luck. It had been a calculated assassination attempt by the only woman he had trusted, an attempt that had failed to kill him but had succeeded in enslaving him to her care for 7 years, while she drained over $50 million from the family trusts. The revelation was a physical blow that seemed to re-shatter his spine, but it was followed by a second, equally powerful discovery. Thorne played a recording from the office of the pension attorney Kimberly had visited years ago. In the unedited audio, Kimberly's voice rang out with a fierce, unmistakable integrity as she rejected a suggestion to inflate her claims for a larger payout. She had told the lawyer that she wanted only what was fair from Michael's memory and her daughter's future, stating that she would rather scrub floors for the rest of her life than trade her husband's honor for a check. Gregory realized then that every word Diane had whispered, every proof she had presented, was a mirror of her own corruption. He had cast out the only people who had ever looked at him and seen a man instead of a bank account, and he had done it at the behest of the woman who had put him in the chair in the first place. A cold, righteous fury, more powerful than any he had ever known, took hold of him. And for the first time in 7 years, Gregory Roberts didn't feel like a victim. He felt like a man with a debt to pay. The confrontation with Diane was swift and absolute. When she entered the study, expecting to find him broken, she was met with the recording of her own voice. Her face transformed, the mask of the doting aunt melting away to reveal a cornered, vicious animal. She tried to bluster, to threaten, to claim it was a deep fake. But Gregory had already contacted the authorities and the board of directors. As the police led her away in handcuffs through the grand foyer she had hoped to own, Gregory didn't even watch. He was already in the car, Gary pushing the Cadillac to its limits as they raced toward the south side. They found Kimberly and Michelle in a cramped, two-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, the air smelling of detergent and exhaust. Kimberly opened the door, her eyes tired and her spirit guarded, but when she saw Gregory sitting there in the hallway not as a titan of industry, but as a man whose soul was visible through the cracks in his pride, the anger in her gaze softened into a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. Gregory didn't lead with a check or a legal document. He sat in his chair, his head bowed, and he told her the truth about the breaks, the embezzlement, and his own devastating cowardice. He told her that he had been so afraid of being used that he had forgotten how to be loved, and that he had spent 7 years letting a murderer tell him who his friends were. He wept then, deep, racking sobs of a man who was finally letting the fire of his past burn itself out. Michelle came to the door, seeing her fast man in tears, and with the instinctual grace of a child, she walked over and leaned her head against his shoulder. Kimberly looked at the recording Gregory had brought, the proof of her own integrity that she had never asked for in. She realized that the man before her was truly seeing her for the first time. She reached out and took his hand, her grip as strong as the day they had danced at the gala, and she told him that a house can be rebuilt, and so can a heart, provided you start with a foundation that isn't made of secrets. The move to the ranch was Gregory's final act of liberation. He sold the Chicago estate, a building that held too many shadows, and purchased 500 acres of rolling hills and open sky on the outskirts of the city. He designed the ranch himself, a masterpiece of accessibility, where there were no stairs, no barriers, and no rooms where a child's laughter couldn't reach. But the most important feature was the fields. Under Michelle's direction, they've planted thousands of sunflowers, a vast, golden ocean that stretched to the horizon. Michelle loved them because sunflowers were the only plants that spent their entire lives following the light, a lesson she insisted the adults needed to remember. Gregory's company was restructured into a global leader in accessible technology and firefighter support, but his most important work happened on the ranch, where he spent his afternoons teaching Michelle how to ride a modified ATV and his evenings watching the sunset with Kimberly. On the 1-year anniversary of their move, a small group of friends gathered in the center of the tallest sunflower field for a wedding that had no guest list of socialites or millionaires. There was only the fire department crew, Gary, and the vast, blue Illinois sky. When the music began, a simple, acoustic melody, played by a fellow firefighter, there was no polished ballroom floor. There was only the packed earth of the ranch and the swaying gold of the flowers. Gregory took Kimberly's hands, his chair turning in slow, elegant circles as they danced in the dirt. He was still a man in a chair, and he always would be, but as he looked at the woman who had saved him from a fire, he didn't. Even though it was burning, he realized that he had never been more mobile. He had learned that the only true paralysis is the one we impose on ourselves through fear, and that the greatest wealth in the world isn't found in a bank, but in the courage to let someone lead you into the light. The millionaire and the firefighter had found their rhythm, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sunflowers bowed their heads, content in the knowledge that they were no longer the only ones in that field who knew how to find the sun.